Continuing with digital tiers, we look at other minds. Now, the approach here is this. One way to argue that the real world is superior to the virtual world of the experience machine, or virtual worlds in general, is to assert the superiority of the real world by focusing on the alleged fakeness of the inhabitants of the virtual world. And the reasoning would be that if these beings are not real, they lack moral status, and what is done to them and done to them simply doesn't matter. They would be like toasters. While it would be stupid to take your toaster and smash it into pieces, it wouldn't be wrong, just kind of dumb. So this takes us into the problem of other minds. Now, as a general problem in epistemology, the theory of knowledge, the problem is this. How do I know that these other seeming beings have minds similar enough to my own that they think and feel, that they're not just automatons walking around without thinking or feeling? Now, in the context of this particular work, the question is this. How do I know that other beings, real or virtual, have minds similar enough to my own to grant them an appropriate moral status? So the critical claim is this. The inhabitants of the virtual world have either no moral status or a vastly inferior moral status, thus making the real world superior. And the issue would be this. Whether the experiences of a non-virtual person in the experience machine have less value if the virtual beings with whom they interact lack the moral status of actual beings in the real world. Now, in order to make this distinction, we have to know something really important. Namely, we would need to know that real beings have minds providing moral status and virtual beings do not. And this could be presented as the problem of other moral statuses, if you wanted to add another problem to epistemology. And this is the epistemic question of knowing whether or not other beings have the moral qualities that I allegedly possess. So what is the stock solution to the problem of other minds? It's been around a long time, and so philosophers have worked out kind of a standard way of addressing it. It obviously doesn't succeed perfectly, otherwise we would say, hey, remember that problem of other minds and how we solved it. But here's the stock solution. It's an argument by analogy. And here's how it would go. Since I have a mind, I reason that beings that seem like me have similar minds as well. I also infer that they would have a moral status similar to my own. And this would also work for beings such as animals. As we saw, in our good dead friend Descartes, his view that animals don't have these minds. Now, this reasoning is, of course, inductive. Like some reasoning by analogy using, that inductive reasoning. So, being an inductive argument, that means even if all the premises are true and the reasoning, is good, meets all the standards of an argument by analogy, the conclusion could still be mistaken, because that's how induction works. Because no matter how strong an inductive argument works, by definition, the conclusion could still be wrong. Now, because of this uncertainty, accepting that real beings have moral status requires a presumption of status, which would be this. Though I do not know that such beings have qualities needed for moral status, I presume that they do. This presumption rests on the perceived qualities of the allegedly real beings. So when I see what I take to be other people, I notice that they use language. They talk. They have apparent expressions of emotions and feelings. They express, happiness and sadness. Now, as I have no access to the metaphysical reality of their being, I must rely on their service behavior. I cannot, know their pain. I can see them exhibiting pain behavior, but I have no access to the metaphysical reality. So the obvious criticism of this argument by analogy is to note that the observation is based on a single case, namely myself. So it makes the argument rather weak, because I'm saying I have these qualities, other people are like me, they have the qualities as well. And of course, I'm also generalizing from the people I've observed to all of humanity. Because even, I believe that even people I've not met, that they too, have these qualities. So I can reply to that criticism, which is it's a solid criticism. It's going right after the weak point of the argument by analogy, and also the weak point of the generalization. So the reply is this. Obviously enough, the problem of other minds is such that by the nature of the problem, I am limited to observing myself. And whether there are any other observers is precisely what is in question. While this is admittedly a weak inference, it is the best possible inference in the circumstances. So we could say it's a bad argument, but it's also at the same time the best argument, because it seems to be the only one possible. So what about the virtual minds? So in the case of virtual beings, it is uncertain as to whether they would possess minds or the qualities required to have moral status. Now, it is very tempting, because of science fiction, etc., or prejudices, to assume virtual beings cannot possess these qualities. Now, the problem of other minds, the general problem, shows that their status is only, strictly speaking, marginally more in doubt than that of real beings. Also, simply assuming being virtual denies them moral status would be a question begging prejudice. Because if someone said, why don't they have status? And someone says, well, I just assume they don't, therefore they don't, would beg the question. Circular reasoning, a classic fallacy. So, we should extend the same presumption that we extend to, or rather I extend to other people, because I don't know if there are really other people. This same presumption should be extended not only to what I consider to be people in the real world, but also virtual beings of the experience machine. So why should I do that? Well, of course I'm going to argue for it. So here's how I justify this presumption of status. And of course, I'm going to use an analogy because I'm a philosopher and that's kind of what we do. So I'm going to use an analogy to the presumption of innocence in American law. And this is based on the moral and legal assumption that it is better to assume someone's innocent and risk, the guilty people go free than to risk, punishing the innocent so that the guilty may be punished. So we have this, in theory at least, a presumption of innocence because we think it's, or assume it's worse, to punish the innocent than to allow the guilty to escape punishment. So what would be the presumption of, status here? Well, it would be this. It is better to treat an entity, virtual or real, that lacks status as having status than to deny an entity with moral status that status. To be a little clear about it, basically it's better to, if you have doubts, like I don't know if this being has status or not, it's better to, treat it with status than to not do so. Because if you're right, but it has status, then you've done, good, you've acted correctly. If you're wrong, typically no big loss there. But if you treated it that it doesn't have status, and then, treat it accordingly, then you would be, and it does, you'd be wronging that entity. Now the obvious objection is this. These are virtual beings and not real beings. You've watched too much science fiction. So how to counter this? Well, looking at the epistemology, of course, how do we know? I don't know that the inhabitants of the real world have minds. And so I grant them a status on the basis of an analogy and a presumption of status. So I extend it to what I think are other people because first, arguing by analogy, and secondly, because of this presumption of status. That if I were wrong in my belief, and I believed that there were no people and started doing, treating people like, toasters, then that would be horrible. So even though I don't know for sure, the consequences of me being wrong, if I think people are just things and not people, would be so terrible that even if there's only a slight chance I'd be right, that I should act that way. So, granting virtual beings this status on the basis of the analogy, presumption of status, would seem to the right thing to do, again, by analogy. So, I could have relevantly similar moral obligations to beings in a virtual world as I do in this real world. This, I contend, grounds the value of experiences in the virtual world. They would have moral significance comparable to the experiences of the real world. Because in the real world, to be honest, since I've studied a lot of epistemology, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you have thoughts and feelings. I believe you do, but I don't know. And even though I don't know, I presume that you do and have status. And so my actions, I infer, do matter morally. Likewise, in the virtual world, if I don't know that the beings there have moral status, if they act in ways similar to the way I act, I have to extend this same courtesy. And to simply say, they're just virtual, that would be prejudice. That would be analogous to, say, racism towards people in the real world. So, conclusion. There are compelling reasons for granting the beings of the experience machine moral status. If only an ersatz, and again, ersatz doesn't mean like fake, it means, sort of like virtual or like, and so it's not a deception, it's just that it doesn't have it for real, it has it, virtually in a way. So, even if we only grant these beings an ersatz status or presumed status, it's reasonable to do so, based on the problem of other minds. And therefore, there are compelling reasons to believe that life in this experience machine, the virtual reality, would have value. The fact that it's not known, if there is a really real world for real, makes accepting this appealing. Otherwise, and here's the scary implication, the value of one's own existence rests on metaphysics that are forever uncertain. So if it requires that you must know that someone is real and the world is real in order to have value, well, we can never know that. It would rest forever on this uncertain metaphysics. Now, here's a counter. The value of existence rests on metaphysical hypotheses that are equally uncertain. So, reply, well, this places the allegedly real world and the virtual world in the same uncertain footing. So there are no grounds to claim the value of virtual world experience is any less or any less certain than the value of real world experiences, because we don't know. And if the virtual world is, by hypothesis, as Nozick presents it, indistinguishable from the real world in terms of the experiences, we would have no grounds for this distinction, except for just saying somehow a person, well, you could almost say magically knows the metaphysics of reality. So in sum, the experience machine can create worlds and inhabitants on par with the real world. So they should be regarded as having comparable value and status. To hold otherwise would seem to be a mere bias, a prejudice, in favor of the real over the virtual. So that takes the end of Digital Tears. Stay safe, and I will see you in the future.